Sam Dodge, welcome. Thanks so much for speaking with me today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So first of all, could you maybe help us understand how big the homelessness problem is in San Francisco? How many people are using social services considered homeless in the whole year?
Okay, over the full course of the year, we have two different counts that we've typically looked at. It looks like we average around 20,000 people that have an experience of homelessness and have an official engagement with some part of San Francisco's homeless and health structure. Our Department of Public Health counts around 18,000, and our homeless services counts around 22,000. So at any one point in time, it looks like we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 people that are experiencing homelessness, both within our institutional programs and unsheltered on the street. They're sort of evenly divided.
So does the 20,000 individuals include people who are in permanent housing?
No, it doesn't.
So that would add another 10,000 individuals.
So we're
not homeless anymore, but they're sort of like.
We have a pretty extensive permanent supportive housing network of units in San Francisco. It's over 9,000 units, and there's couples in some of those, and so some of them are for families. So we have over 10,000 people living in permanent supportive housing, as well as a number of subsidy programs, along with a number of veterans programs and others that would add to that total of housing. So we also have a pretty extensive eviction defense and homeless prevention programs that in San Francisco, where we fully fund eviction defense, and we have back rent programs and others which also help prevent homelessness, that help address another group of people that aren't counted in that 22,000, and that also are at risk of homelessness, but we're at pretty high success level in preventing it.
And how much is the total budget for all the people you just mentioned just now?
It's a little bit of a moving target right now, because there's a lot of federal and state support due to COVID. But as a sort of steady state, it's around $600 million now. This is a newly big infusion of investment from the local tax here on large businesses. So that basically doubled the investments that San Francisco is able to make from the state and federal and local dollars, from around 300 million up to a little north of 600 million.
I see, thank you. And also on the same report I showed you, it says between 2021 and 23, there will be a $400 million one-time investment from local and federal government, and plus ongoing operations and services from Prop C funding to fund historic expansion in permanent supportive housing. I'm just curious, is that number somehow in the budget that we just saw? The money that we're going to use to build more housing?
Yes, so this is a lot of there's some special programs from the state, the federal and local, that are going to expand housing options for the people that are long-term homeless with complex conditions. And so they will be a third of their income, and then on-site there'll be supportive services and case managers and program support. So that's what we call supportive housing, right? And some of those are state program called Home Key, which is to buy and convert tourist hotels into permanent supportive housing. And some of that is the Our City, Our Home, which was that local tax I mentioned that's on large business revenues. And so that is designated to go largely to permanent supportive housing. So that has capital and operating budgets delineated in it, and an oversight committee to oversee its purchases and to recommend budget expenditures to the city and county board of supervisors. All that money is in the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing budget. And like we went over, our current budget for HSH, something around less than 25% of the budget is for people currently experiencing homelessness and the program serving them, both outreach and shelters and navigation centers and safe sleeping villages and all these kind of various congregate and non-congregate emergency housing situations. And 75% is for serving people that are permanently housed, either in permanent supportive housing or that sort of prevention, problem solving kind of issues for people that are at risk of homelessness.
So that's the 75% or 68%, whatever that number is, which is for housing, right? So we can see that. Okay, let me just maybe share the screen really quick. So basically we can see it's this 60% plus the 8%, that's for housing. So like, I understand it's for supporting the current permanent supportive housing, but does it also include like capital investment into new future housing?
Yes, some capital. There is also separately another couple of government agencies that do invest in housing. So there's a mayor's office of housing, which is a department under the mayor that does work on building new housing opportunities and manages those opportunities.
Yeah.
And then there's just a couple of other, there's HUD and there's a couple of other, public housing, and there's other arms of the government that are working on housing.
I see. Okay, but that's like the HUD money is already in the budget, isn't it? Like, do they give more?
Some of it is for homeless serving programs, but not for like public housing or Section 8 or other sorts of subsidy programs that are from the federal government. There's the Veterans Administration funds, a sort of a special housing subsidy that's called a VASH subsidy. So there's some other entities out there that are funding other things that aren't captured by those numbers.
I see. So if you were to build a new permanent supportive housing unit tomorrow, most likely the money will come out of what we just saw, the pie chart, the 60% will come out of there.
Yes, and it will come out of that capital money that's set aside.
I see. And then, I mean, because that 60% also has to support some of the existing housing units, right? And so not all of them will be used to build more housing. So how many units of new permanent supportive housing are added each year in San Francisco, roughly?
It depends on how it's been these different years based on, federal and state support, and now this new local support. There was a previous time where San Francisco used a fair amount of their welfare grant program expenditures. It was under a program by a previous mayor, now Governor Gavin Newsom, called Care Not Cash, which redirected direct cash payments into a pool of funds that was used to lease and staff leased buildings of residential hotels. And it was really rather successful. So at that point, there was a sort of a growth in the programs. And then once they, had reached their capacity for leasing, it was sort of just maintaining that capacity. So there was a long time where there was very little growth. And then the federal government started to participate more under Obama and Bush. And so there was another expansion of supportive housing. So it really is just, it reflects the inputs. So now there's pretty significant inputs coming in, and it's looking like that we're going to expand by around 1,500 units a year for the next couple of years.
Oh, that's great. I think it might be just a number mistake. I was looking at they have a data set for housing stock for each COC. And I was looking at San Francisco COC, which is CA-501. And it says, I was looking at the permanent supportive housing unit, which is really strange that in 2019, there were about 10,000 units, but in 2020, it was down to 5,000 units. So is that just a number error? That can be, right? How can you have a unit and then disappear?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what they were counting there. Sometimes it depends on how we're counting and what they want. They change different definitions sometimes. Sometimes they want to know how many units the federal government is supporting through the COC. And sometimes they want to know how many units the city has in general dedicated to people experiencing homelessness. And so it can be different. There's also we've taken some tactical changes and are converting some units into non-congregate shelter. Sometimes we've converted transitional housing into permanent housing. So those same units would shift categories. So I don't know, I would have to look at the underlying data. It's just, some of that HUD stuff is not too great because they change the definitions quite frequently.
So roughly, do you know what percentage of the unsheltered homeless individuals in San Francisco migrated from out of the city?
It's a tricky definition. On both sides, there can be a sort of the true Scotsman fallacy, right? So we have to start with the question, what does it mean to be a San Franciscan? Because is it 10 years or more of residency here? Is it your last, permanent address? Is it the county where you were born? I get different definitions from different people that I, encounter in the community. There's a welfare definition that is tied to entitlement benefits, which is 2 weeks. So the government has a very a 2-week definition to residency. So, and that's just a long-term welfare definition. Many other countries have different definitions where you register to your county, Germany or England or other places. And then if you need social services, they bill your home county or return you to your home county. We don't quite have that sort of relationship. So it's a little bit slippery slope. We do a follow-up interview with people, with 2,000 individuals, with 1 to 2,000 individuals after our point in time count. We just conducted it last Wednesday. They're doing these interviews right now. From that, they will extrapolate some data, and we publish those reports along with our biannual homeless census. And so you can look at there and see that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness at any one point in time in San Francisco are from San Francisco and have a long experience of living in San Francisco. I mean that the majority of it had 10 or more years in San Francisco and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because why would you be here and suffering the humiliations of homelessness in this very expensive city? Whereas we talked about our expensive services and investments, but we didn't really talk about the other side of the ledger, maybe enough, which is say that it's a sort of an overwhelming demand for a sort of slim number of vacancies in our programs, which are often oversubscribed. So the reason that you might persist in that situation is that you have a long and ties to the city, and that you have no other place where you belong like you belong here. And so that is often the case. Now, when I want to just differentiate between a sort of a point in time and a follow-up survey of a smaller set of those point in time people, and those people that might take those surveys, the sort of selection of those people, even if unintended, versus the over the year, the 8,000 number from the point in time count, the over year, the 22,000, 18,000, depending on how we count. The vast majority of people, if you didn't have a very strong tie to the city, they might move through the city. They might test our shelters or ask for help, but then they might migrate to other parts of the country where they have other opportunities, family, friends, other things. So that's sort of what we've experienced as a dynamic throughout the year, a sort of two homeless populations. And then we often find that there's a lot of people within Northern California and the Bay Area more specifically have family, friends, and work ties that transfer across the different city boundaries. We have a lot of small cities, and San Francisco is a sort of service capital for the area, which San Francisco has less than 1 million people, but the Bay Area overall is probably 8 or more million. So there is a sort of a draw for people to locally migrate to emergency services in the Bay Area. So if people are from out of the city, they're mostly from within the region. And if they're not from within this immediate region, they're mostly from within the state. But it's a very low bar. I mean, the point isn't exactly how they establish that 2 weeks residence. It's just that I think that most people would consider, if you just showed up into a town for 2 weeks, that you're not necessarily a resident of that town. Honestly, when you look at many other countries and how they deal with homelessness, they bifurcate the people that are part of their 5 to 10 million person nation, and then anyone else, even if, like, say you're in Europe and you're part of the free movement, the Shenzhen region, where people are moving for work and stuff, if they're not actually, Finnish, they're one of the 5 million Finnish people, they're going to have a separate programs for you that if you're experiencing homelessness than what they consider really their homelessness to solve. So it's very interesting in the United States that we just don't have barriers like that. Even within California, which of course would be like a huge nation in the world, or the county, there's not like, hey, if you're a local resident, you get this. If you're not local, you get that. We try to do some work because just the lack of enough for everyone. If people do have options and opportunities that are with friends and families that are out of the city, we try to connect them back to that and through a Homeward Bound program. And then also too, we use housing subsidies that are flexible enough to take out of the county. If you have an opportunity to rent an apartment that say within commuting distance, that we do have programs that'll financially support you while you're living outside of the county in an apartment.
So how much, on YouTube, there are always some kind of like, I think eye-catching videos saying, oh, San Francisco has so many homeless individuals because they give out a lot of subsidies, a lot of assistance, cash assistance. Is that true? How much money can a person living in tent receive from the government in a month?
Well, we had talked earlier about first of all, Milton Friedman lived in San Francisco. I think there's a lot more neoliberal fiscal conservatism to the way that the government is structured and our benefits are distributed in San Francisco than most people have recognized on YouTube or other places. And, you know, California has this long tradition of sort of fiscal conservancy and, you know, a sort of, this sort of way, right? I mean, this is where Nixon and Reagan were from, and this is, you know, the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and this is a sort of a bastion of sort of conservative thought when it comes to a lot of our government programs. We have the other side as well, but I think people forget that there is so much of that in our systems and government here. And, you know, these things, the residue is still there. So, you know, I had mentioned earlier this welfare reform measure that was passed by the now Governor Gavin Newsom in an initiative with the voters, and it's called Care Not Cash. And that means that if you're unsheltered and you are looking for a welfare benefit, you get a very small amount of money. It used to be $75. And that was reduced from over $300 every 2 weeks. The rest of that money is sequestered into a fund that pays for shelter and housing. And so you are guaranteed a shelter bed if you sign up for entitlement, if you sign up for welfare benefits. Now, if you're senior or disabled, and you qualify and are receiving federal disability benefits or Social Security benefits, you get that benefit. I mean, it's not, no one is taking that from you. So, but the city and county administers the welfare benefit, and they get that small welfare benefit. Now, the way that that program is structured, it was passed by the voters. If there is not a shelter bed to offer that person in that moment, they will get cashed out for their welfare benefit.
How much?
It very rarely happens, but it has happened and before. And so then they do get that pre-Care Not Cash benefit that one time until the shelter bed is made available, and then their shelter disbursement is reduced back down again.
So that would be the $600 per month, right? When there's no shelter beds available.
Yes, yes. So it's just a very rare, weird incident. You know, we're using all our shelter capacity to the brink right now. It's a little bit reduced to be safe for COVID and following health guidelines. So there's not as many bunk beds and not as many people packed in as tight as it used to be. We've also, you know, been working really intently with non-police dispatched emergency medicine units. We have a bunch of special teams, street crisis response team, a street wellness response team that have, you know, emergency medicine and outreach workers going to respond to incidents that often involve a homeless person. These people need resources like shelter resources and others. And so they're using those to help, you know, resolve crises on our streets. And that is leading to the shelters being higher utilization. Also to keep more stable populations in the shelters due to COVID and testing and everything, we've taken time limits off of the shelters. So there's really no limit to people's shelter stay as long as they need it. And this is a practice in many communities, but it's a new practice to San Francisco, which used to have a 90-day stay for everyone.
There's no limit. Well,
no,
in that case, for people who are not sheltered, it will be even harder for them to find a shelter bed, right? Because people who are in shelters, they don't have to get out.
Well, if they want to be housed, and they do want to be housed, the length of stay is still averaging 90 days.
Mm-hmm. And then they move out to housing, or they go back to the street?
Well, we don't geotag them like animals and put a thing. They are adults This is all adults we're talking about. So people can make adult decisions all they want. They don't have to call back and tell us what they're doing in a month or 6 months. But yes, people do move out to permanent supportive housing and other government supportive housing. People move out to private housing options. People move out to families, girlfriends, partners, buddies, roommates, jobs. There's, as diverse as the people that, need to use the shelters.
Right. So just now you mentioned, can I just share the screen really quick? Okay, just because otherwise I can't really describe this. So this is some number that I found on the by the HUD data set. Basically shows like the unsheltered and sheltered individuals over time in San Francisco. And then so you can see like this, we have about 5,000, this data much better than I do, 5,000 unsheltered and 3,000 sheltered, right? So in that case, seems like we do have a shelter shortage, right?
Yes.
So in that case, like if there's someone in a tent right now on the street, most likely you don't have a shelter bed to offer to that person.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not for all of them. For any one person, yes. There's turnover and attrition in the shelter stock. And so for any one person, there's a shelter bed every day. But for everyone, there's not.
Yeah, but like I'm just saying, like this 5,000 people, they don't have shelter beds, right?
No, and this is part of the whole thing that's really so and that's a point in time in everything.
Yes, point in time. Yeah.
Yeah, and so
so they know shelter.
Yeah, there's no right to shelter, and there's no plan or funding or anything to make sure that everyone is sheltered. There's no right to housing assistance. It's absolutely a very challenging situation because it's not acknowledged as a true need, right? And there's not delineated a true responsibility. Right. So who exactly is responsible for providing enough shelter and housing opportunities? Is it the city of San Francisco? Is it, the county? Mm-hmm. Is it the state? Is it the federal government? Our system is really built upon the federal government and the HUD being the responsible party. Mm. But they are not taking that responsibility. And so out of their retreat, you have increasing investments from the locals. But as they keep retreating more and more, and so the local investments only backfill some of the retreat, not all of the retreat. So it seems like a large investment, but it's really a shallow investment compared to the disinvestment.
Okay, San Francisco passed the 10-year plan in 2004, basically eliminated, basically stopped building new shelters. So we don't have data before 2007, but you can see the shelter space capacity was flat. And then after 2014, they started to rebuild again, right? So I think is it maybe a little too late, too little? Is that fair to say?
Too little, too late. No, okay. So I think that there's some things that you're gonna. So for this 10-year plan, an important part in there is this care not cash and this huge expansion of permanent supportive housing. And I'll say, there's a thing about permanent supportive housing in that it works very well. There's very low eviction rates and attrition within there. There's the mortality attrition is the largest. And so the turnover might be 10% a year. So an actual 200 unit building, right? We're talking about 20, it's really good for 20 exits a year from homelessness. But as you bring it on, you get like 10 years worth in 1 year, right? Because you get all 200.
Right.
So this first 10-year plan, you had this huge expansion of permanent supportive housing for the first time really in San Francisco. And so you had this sort of outsized influence of these new supportive housing units. And so I think under the background of relatively stable state, sort of a lower level housing crisis, you know, at the time it felt like very urgent and very horrible and extreme housing prices. But what we know from data across the country is that local determinants of the local determinant of a homeless population is the degree of rent increases, not the fixed rent rate, but the increases. And so we had this from a regression analysis, but then Zillow kind of rehashed it and did it again. They used the point in time count information, which is a little bit, it's just because it's what they had, but I think it kind of obscures it a little bit. But so I think what we're really seeing in this next wave here is just a really intensifying housing crisis and not the same amount of investments for a while. Now we're starting to have these investments. They haven't really hit yet, but hopefully that will stabilize the situation. But I think that, you know, you're not going to see like really dramatic solutions within a place like San Francisco because it's really a feeder for a larger catchment area than its own county. You might see some good dramatic results from efficient program administration and distribution of resources in sort of, you know, some counties in the United States that aren't such a magnet. And I think also too, the matter of fact is that San Francisco does have a sort of attraction as a drug culture and sort of a laissez, you know, a sort of openness to drug use that other communities are not. And so that does lead to an added wrinkle to our service provision and sort of reasoning why people might try to make a life here or might end up here.
I mean, since you mentioned drug dealing and drug use, like what percent, this maybe there's no official data, but just like roughly based on your observation, like, you know, roughly what percentage of the drug dealers on San Francisco streets are not from San Francisco?
Drug dealers?
Yeah, like international, some kind of international organizations.
Well, there's a lot of different drug dealers in San Francisco, you know, but you know, some are dealing to people in Pacific Heights and they're working on the cell phones and they're delivering it. But San Francisco has a sort of situation where in the Tenderloin area, it's a central neighborhood in San Francisco, that there's, you know, a number of different international organizations that are both, you know, importing drugs and importing people to deal those drugs. And so I don't know how alone we are in that, but it's a very large open air drug market. It's very detrimental, and it does seem to rely on interchangeable low wage it's sort of independent contractors that have trafficked. I mean, we kind of look at it sometimes as if it's a little more complex relationship than that, but that they're not making very much money, and they are sort of controlled by the syndicate that brought them here. So we see a lot of people from Central American and that have been brought here and that are trying to deal drugs. And largely now it's fentanyl and methamphetamines, two very strong drugs that are hard to regulate in the body. So we have a large overdose crisis as well. And so these drugs appeal and work for people that are in miserable situations, which often overlap with people experiencing homelessness. So it's been a crisis situation for our system of care, and it's been very difficult to manage.
Like on TV, you always see like DEA or FBI showed up, and and so in this case, who is responsible to deal with the international drug dealers?
Yeah, the FBI is a real important player here. Often we find that from previous drug busts and through just experience, we'll see people commuting in, living in group houses in the East Bay that are part of these drug dealing syndicates that are on the corners, many corners in the Tenderloin in South of Market. And so, I've heard reports from some of them that, they're given a certain amount of drugs every day and they need to come back with a certain amount of money at the end of the day to come back into the house. And they work in shifts, and I commute on BART, and sometimes I'm looking across the way at people I recognize from the corners dealing drugs. So, none of them have helicopters or, chemical manufacturing plants. So it's obviously something much bigger than them. And, I think that, the people, when they're using drugs, they're often in crisis, and it's solving a sort of problem, and it has a logical conclusion for them. It's obviously causing other problems, but it's a really tough situation. And I think that it's not a situation that San Francisco faces alone. Obviously, there's many other states and places that have higher percentage of meth use. And honestly, it's the meth that's been the most troublesome. And the fentanyl, the opioids sort of fit on top of the meth. And so meth and fentanyl and heroin use do not directly correlate to the local homeless populations. Like we said, through regression analysis and others, it's the housing scarcity leading to increasing rents that really affect the local homeless population.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, thank you. Hold on just a second. Let me just get this straight. Sam Dodge, thank you so much today for speaking with me.
All right. Thank you. It's been my honor.